This show is made possible by the generous contributions of these sponsors.
This conflict defined an entire generation of Americans. 2.7 million brave men and women served in uniform during the undeclared war. 58,000 were killed. The Medal of Honor was awarded to 240 soldiers. More than 325,000 Pennsylvanians fought in the war. Stark figures tell the story. 3,147 were killed in action. 90 are still unaccounted for.
Usually you put your tour in and hopefully made it out of there. A lot of my friends didn't. And they're, of course, on the wall down in Washington, D.C. And they left families behind.
We must never forget the pain and sufferings that linger today for those who fought with honor and distinction, those whose loved ones never really made it home. Respect those who honorably served during more than a decade of fighting in the challenging terrains of Southeast Asia. These soldiers faced extraordinary and unprecedented dangers, hampered by a government back home that was uncertain how it wanted to defeat the enemy. For numerous reasons, returning warriors were scorned, harassed, and spat on when they returned to the States. Vietnam vets seldom experienced open arms, applauding crowds, welcome home parades, and shouted thank yous.
And I am still very appalled at the way that we were all treated. When I was at the airport, when I landed on my way back from Vietnam, I took off my boots and I had a trash can in my room, and I dropped my boots in the trash can, and I took off my fatigues and I put it on top of my boots, and I got into my civilian clothing and I left, and I never had that clothing on again. I'm so hurt at the way that we were all treated.
It was Civil War General William Sherman who coined the phrase, "War is hell." This is Gary Ream. He graduated from Carlisle High School in 1964, enlisted in the Marine Corps. On November 3rd, 1966, assigned as a rifleman, he was killed in action in Quang Nam Province. While acting as a point on patrol, the action of the 20-year-old warrior saved the lives of 10 other men who avoided an ambush because of his sacrifice.
I was a senior in high school, so when I got home that evening, the Marine officer and another gentleman was with my mother, and they had already told her, and they were there to console her. So
shock, disbelief.
Yeah, well, and it had been over a year since we had seen him, so it's like, it's always in the back of your mind, he may never come home, but when reality hits, and it was hard.
And what about Gary himself as a young man, never married?
I don't think we ever called him Gary. He was always Peanut. Yeah. He was the smallest of 6 kids, and he just got the name, and he was fun-loving, mischievous at times.
Go back a half century before Peanut enlisted. What would he have been up to?
Well, we had good times going, like we go to family picnics at Meadowbrook and go swimming, lead towards spring, and he was always fun to hang around with. The boys, the brothers, and neighborhood kids would get together and have football or baseball games back at Leetor Park. He enjoyed going to the YMCA when it was on High Street, and they would go to Camp Thompson up near Laurel Lake in the summertime.
Lance Corporal Ream joined the Marines with fellow high school classmate Edward J. Rykowski. Both men never returned alive from Vietnam. A Gold Star family recognition of the 20-year-old Rykowski's death is quite terse. During his service in the Vietnam War, Marine Corps Lance Corporal Rykowski experienced a traumatic event which ultimately resulted in loss of life. Recorded circumstances attributed to: died through hostile action, small arms fire, body not recovered. Incident location: South Vietnam, Quang Nam Province.
I remember it was August 1866. He went MIA, and I guess it was about 2 weeks later I got a letter from my dad about it. And I remember that day like it was yesterday. Well, it was just years of trying to find his remains. And that's been ongoing. The Marine Corps, after 35 years, they listed him KIA, and then they had it changed back to MIA. So we're still waiting on his remains.
Like his comrade in arms, Lance Corporal Ream, Ed Rajkowski was a talented athlete. He loved playing sports, specifically one.
He didn't play football. He did play some baseball, but his forte was on the mat. And he was a leader. He was like a 2-year wrestler. Had he had a 3rd or 4th year, we knew he was going to be a champion. I mean, he took district champions right to the limit, and he was like a raw rookie.
Paul Stahl wonders what it would have been like if his wrestling partner would have returned home. And speaking of coming home, he has one wish.
Well, we miss him. I'm only one of probably in this county thousands of people that knew him, and we just hope and pray that we can get his remains back and have final closure for him and his family.
The helicopter joined the military in the late 1950s and early 60s. Marine Captain David Bennett piloted them when they were first used in the war.
We could, with these very versatile, rapidly moving, small machines, take groups of soldiers into landing zones which were too small for paradrops, too small for airplanes, and bring the fight to the enemy. We could also resupply our troops. We could also bring out the wounded. So the availability of these highly flexible tools, the helicopters of different kinds, was exceptionally useful to reviewing the operation we had.
To this day, the captain vividly remembers what his job was as a Marine Corps pilot. In his words, he existed to support the troops on the ground who were physically fighting the war.
It was to bring them into assault areas to attack the enemy. It was to resupply them with fuel, water, medical supplies, ammunition, fuel, evacuate them when they were wounded, or in some cases, take them out when the operation was completed.
You're no safer whether you're battling the enemy from the ground or the air.
In some cases, it was mechanical failure. In some cases, it was because the landing zone was too small and we had to back into it with the crew chief telling us, come back, and avoid chopping trees down with our blades. In some cases, it was on a landing zone shaped like this, not much place to land on. In some cases, the weather. And in some cases, it was also the enemy, the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong, who were trying to shoot us. And in some cases, it would fly into a zone to resupply or to evacuate somebody under heavy enemy fire. And we would come back with a few holes, none of them on my body, none of them on any of my crew or passengers ever, but a few in the holes in the helicopter which the mechanics fixed up.
The helicopter of Vietnam and successive wars has been retrofitted for use in the public sector back in the States, providing medical and law enforcement support. But while war can be hell, some of Bennett's flights provided hope for many.
On a medical evacuation, I would fly out to the hospital ships which were offshore, the USS Sanctuary or the USS Repose, where Navy doctors and Navy nurses spent time patching up the wounded. And those were wonderful flights because we knew we were taking a wounded soldier, Marine, Korean, even Vietnamese, to health and safety as fast and as best as we could.
Today, 90-year-old Forrest Dutch Heisman relaxes in his home along the Conneaguinna Creek north of Carlisle. He graduated from high school in Likens, joined the Air Force, became a pilot, and later retired a full colonel. Some 50-plus years ago, he was piloting a fighter bomber over the skies of Vietnam.
Flying the fighter bomber, the F-4 Phantom, both an air-to-air fighter and air-to-ground ordnance delivery. And we carried everything. The airplane was designed to carry everything from 20 millimeter cannon shells to nuclear weapons. But of course in Vietnam, Southeast Asia, we used just conventional weapons. Bombs, rockets, napalm, cluster bombs, you name it, we could carry it.
Dutch said they had to fear ground-to-air and air-to-air enemy fire. One night, he was on a combat sky spot mission at about 20,000 feet.
And while I was climbing out of Da Nang, I was going up to about, getting up to around 20,000 feet, and all of a sudden there was a bright flash and a big bang, and the airplane jumped up about 300 feet, and I still think today it was a surface-to-air missile that went off under me. But they didn't find any shrapnel marks on the airplane. But it scared me quite a bit. I won't use an adjective to describe it, but I checked the engine instruments and everything looked good. And I said to my back seater, I said, "Hey, the airplane's flying fine." I said, "We're going to continue with the mission."
But from this pilot's point of view, it was an impersonal war.
Everybody thought it was the wrong war, and it was at the time, and felt pretty bad about it because, you know, it's pretty impersonal in the air from an airplane attacking people down on the ground that you can't even see where they are at times.
While Dutch was dropping bombs and avoiding incoming missiles in the air, Joe McDermott was fighting a ground war in Vietnam's tough terrain, including the infamous Battle of Hamburger Hill.
When we were in the Ashall Valley, and my unit was spearheading the Hamburger Hill operation, they had built a new fire base called Firebase Airborne, which was to provide additional artillery support. Well, that fire base, about middle of the time we were at Hamburger Hill, was overrun by the NVA, and so we lost. Some of our artillery support was disrupted, but more important was the loss of lives. Anytime a fire base is overrun, it's chaotic and tragic at the end.
As tough as the fighting was, getting word from home could be just as difficult. And nothing's more important than reading them in the order they were written. How do you do that?
My wife, my lovely wife, would write to me every day, 2 letters a day. She'd mail one in the morning and one in the afternoon, and she would number them so that I knew what sequence to read them. Now, we didn't necessarily get 2 letters each day on the other side. They would come in groups of 6 and 8 and 10 at a time, depending where we were in the field. Because if we were in Camp Evans, they pretty much were consistent. But when we were in the field, we'd get bunches of letters, and each one was numbered, so I knew what sequence to read them.
Da Nang is South Vietnam's second largest city. Today it is known as a tourist capital, with sandy beaches and clear waters, a West Coast location that makes for beautiful sunsets against an impressive backdrop of lush mountains. But more than 50 years ago, it was the place where the first U.S. combat troops landed when the Marines came ashore in Vietnam. It hosted I Corps headquarters, and because of the relative ease in and out, it was home to several military hospitals. And that's where 80-year-old Army nurse Flo Heward chose to serve her time.
We were in a VAC hospital. There are different kinds of hospitals in a combat situation. There's a surgical hospital, but I chose the VAC hospital because what we did was we did what we call the stomachs and chest. These were patients that required immediate care. They couldn't wait.
There are those that say caring for the dead and dying from the battlefield is by far the toughest job in the military. Heward says with time, she learned to handle most of the challenges thrown her way.
The worst thing to me in Vietnam were the sounds. I could get used to the sight of the gore and the bleeding and all of that, and I could get used to the smells. But the sounds of the screaming and the crying kids as they came in scared and wounded. That's a sound I'll never forget. And the sound of helicopters, still to this day, gives me an adrenaline rush. I'll never get over that either. Because when you heard helicopters coming in, you knew that you were going to have a lot of casualties.
Some 11,000 American women participated in the war as support staff and medical personnel. 8 women's names are inscribed on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C. All military nurses, the women died of shrapnel wounds in helicopter crashes or of illnesses while ministering to the wounded. David Calhoun was the Army military advisor to a South Vietnam artillery group. The soldiers spoke either Vietnamese or French. Their living conditions were worse than the regular Army.
I lived, ate, and slept with the Vietnamese that I was advising. We didn't have any American, but we had American support, but we didn't have the things that the American units had, where they had a regular mess hall, and some of them on the bigger bases rode a bus to work. I got a live duck and a live chicken and a bandolier of rice once a month. So, tonight, between 6 of us, we ate your chicken. And tomorrow we would eat my duck. And then, when the ones that were left over, we used to pen up on the perimeter, because if they started squawking, we knew something was out there.
Calhoun said he would sleep 2 hours, wake up and move, find another place to sleep, and repeat. But what happened early this morning happened so quickly, he was caught by surprise.
At that time, a B-40 rocket struck the wall. I had been hit. It exploded to my right. I literally picked up the radio and said, "I'm hit, I'm hit." Another B-40 came in and tore the radio out of my hands and destroyed it. I tried to get out of there and get to the artillery positions kind of behind me, but another rocket struck the wall. It's only about 2 feet high. It was pretty accurate. And I happened to have my arm across, but not zipped, a flak jacket, a Marine flak jacket that I had gotten. But shrapnel struck me in the heart and knocked me out. I was out for a short while.
When Calhoun left the compound headed for medical care, he was deaf, suffering from shrapnel wounds and the shot to the heart that was somewhat protected by the flak jacket. At roughly the same time, a Notre Dame graduate was completing a less than spectacular first season with the NFL in 1968. He was drafted into the U.S. Army that December. He volunteered to fight in Vietnam, and 5 months later, he shipped out with the 196th Light Infantry Brigade. This soldier was Rocky Bleier, who, seriously wounded in battle, would undergo tough rehabilitation for his injuries, return to the gridiron to become a 4-time Super Bowl champion for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Bleier was on patrol when a rifle shot tore through his left thigh. Wounded and bleeding, he kept firing his grenade launcher.
When all of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a grenade come flying in and hit my commanding officer. Bounced off of him, rolled between my feet, and it went off. Flew up through my right foot, knee, and thigh, and again we were in another firefight.
A platoon found its way to Bleier. His fellow soldiers tried to drag him out of harm's way through the night as best as they possibly could, but it got to the point they couldn't drag him anymore because they had been fighting all day as well. They said they'd send a stretcher back for him.
When out of the darkness, 2 black hands reached down and picked me up. Throws me over his shoulder and starts carrying me to the helicopter. Now that helicopter was a long ways away, and this black soldier would put me down, my blood all over him, catch his breath, pick me up again, and continue on. And he got me to that chopper and put me on it. And I never saw him again. Didn't know his name, where he came from. But I'm here today because of a colorblind soldier. Back in 1969, we knew the difference between he being black or I being white. But we were brothers in war.
But that was more than 50 years ago. It's remembered mostly by those who fought in it and those who lost loved ones in the rice paddies and jungle-like mountains of that country. A nationally honored history teacher and his students at Carlisle High School don't want these vets to be forgotten. They began the arduous task of identifying every student who attended or graduated from the Pennsylvania School District.
It will have their name, the year that they graduated or attended, and then what branch of service that they served in. There is over 300 names that have been identified, and then on either side there are 5 flag cases, a total of 10, that identify the 10 men that were killed in action from Carlisle High School during the Vietnam War.
Wagner said he and the students especially appreciated the opportunity to speak with the veterans, something few people had the opportunity to do since the war's end.
I was very surprised at how open the individuals were, because I think a lot of students and even people of my generation were used to veterans of the Vietnam War not talking about their story, particularly to a stranger. So I think the fact that we were interested in at least recognizing them helped them to maybe open up to a stranger who didn't know the story. And 9 times out of 10, it was always ended with thank you for recognizing our service, because we didn't get that when we returned.
So for returning soldiers, it was one where they'd be spat upon, told to change uniforms, not to get any negative feedback from the populace, and so who was not praised for or thanked for their service, but had to repress their feelings and then go about their life as they best possibly can. And they did that, and they did that very proudly until later on when they were finally recognized for their contribution.
So what brought about the change in public opinion? Blyer says it was the first Gulf War.
That war was fought on television in 21 days. Some of my Vietnam friends said, 21 days, man, I was pinned down longer than that war took place. But from the American point of view, it was on television, talked about, this is what we're going to do, and by God, we did that. And went and but as they said, and so you saw it. And from that point on, there were flags on cars, horns beeping, and all of a sudden the veteran once again rose to the stature that they should have been and thanked. And so the Vietnam veteran was, for the first time, was thanked for his service in 90, 91, and 92. And that was the big change that took place.
Reflecting back on the war, it's difficult to be so far flung from home, away from friends and loved ones. It's even more difficult during a holiday, especially when that holiday is Christmas.
The barracks was dark, except I saw a light down the ways a little bit, and I walked towards that light, and as I did, I heard Silent Night playing. And I'll never forget this scene now. When I came across this bunk bed, there was a soldier still in his fatigues, laying on the bed, and he had pictures of his family strewn across his chest. And you could see the tears had been, streaming down his murky face. And Silent Night is playing, and I'm realizing the loneliness and despair that this soldier is feeling. And as I contemplate that, there's thousands of soldiers that went through that night, and every night, and especially at Christmas time. And to this day, if I'm sitting in the church holding my grandson, you can bet when Silent Night is playing, you'll see tears streaming down my face.
The National Commander-in-Chief of the Veterans of Foreign Wars was at the Cumberland County VFW post. Hal Roche, a Gulf War veteran himself, perhaps said it best in referring to the Vietnam vets of the Valley and those throughout the nation.
Thank you. Apologies for a nation that didn't understand the war at the time. A nation that never took the time to get to know the warriors that came back. It's long overdue. Welcome home is a term used a lot, but really, welcome home. Thank you. And as fellow warrior, it's great to be part of your team.
This show is made possible by the generous contributions of these sponsors.